Hey everybody, what's going on? This is Sam from Historic Travels, wishing all of you a good day. I hope you all are doing well and are having a fantastic week. Now, I've got a very special video for you guys today. For today's video, I'm going to try to do the best job that I can and tell you all about the series of events that occurred on board the RMS Titanic during the final stages of the sinking. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, in a nutshell, what we're going to do is we're going to be taking a look at the sinking of the RMS Titanic, and I'm going to try to explain all the events that occurred on this ship from 2:10 a.m., basically the time period just before the final plunge began, all the way up through to 2:20 a.m., when the Titanic dipped beneath the surface. Now, this is a topic that I have covered in the past on this channel. It was a video from a very long time ago. I will post a link to that video if you'd like to watch it in the description below. However, I do think that I can do this video much better now, and thanks to the new research done by Tom Linsky and his team over at Part-Time Explorer, and thanks to the incredible efforts by the team who wrote the Titanic book On a Sea of Glass, I really do think that I can do this video much better. So, why don't you all come along and join me on this video as we now tell the story of what happened to the RMS Titanic and those that were on board her as the final plunge began. But before we do that, I'd like to tell you all real quick about our sponsor for today's video. IceCo is a company that makes portable outdoor equipment designed to help people with their outdoor activities. They have a wide variety of equipment that is designed to suit any type of outdoor activity need you find yourself in. They also make a huge line of portable refrigerator/freezer units that are designed to be taken with you into the outdoors. IceCo was kind enough to send me one of their portable refrigerator/freezer units, the IceCo VL45 Pro S, which I have done a review on in a separate video. And IceCo has also given the green light to hold a giveaway for one of their mini fridges. If you would like to be entered to win one of these mini fridges, please go to my IceCo review video, link in the description, and leave a comment and you will be entered to win. It is Monday, April 15th, 1912, approximately 2:09 a.m. on board the RMS Titanic. At this point in time, Collapsible Lifeboat D, the last lifeboat to be successfully launched from the Titanic by means of the ship's davits, begins to pull away from the Titanic. At the exact same time that Collapsible Lifeboat D was leaving the Titanic, Titanic's Lifeboat Number 2, which had also been launched from the exact same area as Collapsible D, was rounding the Titanic's stern in a desperate attempt to get over to the Titanic's starboard side. Lifeboat Number 2, headed by 4th Officer Boxhall, was the only lifeboat to obey the captain's orders that he gave earlier to have lifeboats return to the Titanic in order to pick up more passengers. Captain Smith had ordered Boxhall in Lifeboat Number 2 to go around to the Titanic's starboard side where he would find an open gangway door, and he was ordered to approach this gangway door where there would be passengers waiting, and he told Boxhall to rescue more passengers from the Titanic from this gangway door into Lifeboat Number 2. Meanwhile, at the front of the Titanic, water was just now beginning to make its way into the A-deck promenade. And at the exact same time that this was happening, the Titanic's bandmaster, Wallace Hartley, led the ship's orchestra in their final piece, Near My God to Thee. Once this song was over, the Titanic's band would break apart, and they would all try to make their escape from the doomed liner as the ship's final plunge began. One quick note about the Titanic's band. When you go back and look at recreations of the Titanic's band playing Near My God to Thee during the ship's final moments, most recreations of this moment show the band playing this song on the Titanic's port side. However, if you go back and look at the testimony, most of the people who reported the band's activities during this time say that the band was actually located on the Titanic's starboard side. More specifically, it seems the Titanic's band was standing right around here at the base of the second funnel, very close to the gymnasium on the Titanic's starboard side. So it is now believed that this was the location that the band was currently positioned at during the ship's final moments, and it's also believed that this is where they were playing Near My God to Thee as the final plunge began. It is now 2:11 a.m. on board the RMS Titanic, and the sinking of the ship is beginning to accelerate. Now, for a while now, the Titanic has had a roughly 10-degree list to port. However, as the sinking continues to accelerate, water is now beginning to find its way into the aft end sections of the Titanic. And this, as a result, would help the Titanic return to more or less an even keel. Now, it's not known if the Titanic would completely even out as the sinking progressed, but one thing is known for certain: the Titanic did not sink with this rapid 10-degree list to port. The ship would even out as the final plunge continued. Now, as the Titanic's A-deck promenade, the space right here underneath the bridge, began to flood, inside of the Titanic, the water had not yet reached A-deck. The water was on B-deck. However, the water was rapidly flooding B deck, and in just a matter of minutes, the water would begin flooding A deck. It is now 2:12 a.m. on board the RMS Titanic. Water has completely flooded the port side A deck promenade and is rapidly flooding the starboard side. On the Titanic's bridge, Captain Smith and Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, are watching the water beginning to creep its way up onto the Titanic's boat deck. Captain Smith turns to Thomas Andrews and says to him, "We cannot stay any longer. She is going. It's time to go." Captain Smith and Thomas Andrews were last seen together, jumping over the port side bridge wing, leaving the Titanic as the final plunge began. Alright, so for the next part in the story, there's going to be a little bit of guesswork here. Because even though we do know that this event did happen, there isn't any official timestamp as to when this event happened. Although, given the testimony that went along with it, I honestly believe it had to have occurred during the Titanic's final moments. So, what am I talking about here? Well, for this story, we're going to move away from the Titanic's bridge, which is currently going under, and head to just aft of the third funnel. Because it's in this area where a very interesting story with the Titanic occurred. Charles Jalkin was the chief baker on board the RMS Titanic, and he definitely has one of the most unique stories from the entire Titanic disaster. You see, Charles did not think he was going to be able to survive the sinking of the ship, so he had one mission in mind. He thought if the Titanic was going to sink, then I'm going to try to make sure that the ship goes down with as little alcohol on board as possible. Alright, so maybe that last comment was a bit of an exaggeration. I mean, Charles Jalkin wasn't flat out wasted or anything, but he definitely was pretty buzzed on the night that the Titanic went down. So anyway, Charles Jalkin was in the Titanic's A-deck pantry just after the third funnel during the final stages of the sinking. And he said that while he was in there, he was trying to get a drink, and he said he heard something buckle within the ship. He described it kind of like hearing steel beams snapping or breaking apart. Now, because he was in a section of the ship just behind the third funnel, this is an area that would be directly affected by the Titanic breaking in too. So basically what he heard was the Titanic structure failing. So he said that right after he heard that snap, he could hear a lot of people up above him on the deck running towards the stern. So at that point, he thought, okay, it's probably best if I get out of the pantry now, and he went to the stern of the Titanic, which is where he would remain throughout the rest of the sinking of the Titanic. It is now 2:13 a.m. on board the RMS Titanic, and water is beginning to rapidly flood the Titanic's boat deck. However, due to the Titanic's sharp list to port, the water has not yet reached the Titanic's starboard side boat deck. It is currently still only on the port side boat deck. At this current time, Second Officer Charles Lightoller was located on the roof of the officers' quarters on the ship's port side right beside the first funnel, working to free one of the Titanic's last two lifeboats that were still on board the ship. You see, even at this late stage in the sinking, there were still two lifeboats on board the Titanic. You've got Collapsible A on the Titanic's starboard side, and you've got Collapsible B located on the Titanic's port side. Both of these lifeboats are located right beside the first funnel, and because of their position on board the ship, everybody on board the Titanic was having a very difficult time in trying to free these lifeboats and get them successfully launched due to how rapidly the Titanic was sinking out from under them. Now, since Lightoller was on the port side roof of the officers' quarters, the lifeboat that he was trying to free was Collapsible Lifeboat B. Him and his team were working to try to lift up this lifeboat and slide it down to the regular boat deck. However, when they attempted this, due to the Titanic's very sharp list to port, when Lightoller and his team lifted up Collapsible B and slid it down to the boat deck, the lifeboat ended up getting flipped upside down and landed on top of the boat deck, just as water was surging over the area and the Titanic's final plunge was officially beginning. After Collapsible Lifeboat B had fallen upside down from the roof of the officers' quarters down to the boat deck, Lightoller didn't know this, but one of the people who was there helping him free Collapsible B had ended up getting trapped underneath the upside-down lifeboat. This was Titanic wireless operator Harold Bride. When Collapsible Lifeboat B got thrown upside down from the roof of the officers' quarters down to the boat deck, he ended up slipping and he fell down to the boat deck with the lifeboat. Basically, Harold Bride landed on top of the boat deck, and then the lifeboat came down on top of him, pinning him to the boat deck of the Titanic as water began to rapidly flood underneath the lifeboat where he was trapped underneath. However, this wasn't that big of a deal for Harold Bride, because even though this could have been very serious, where he and this lifeboat landed on the boat deck, water was rapidly flooding this area. So it didn't take long before Collapsible B ended up floating off of the boat deck. And once this happened, Harold Bride simply held his breath, swam underneath the lifeboat, and came back up to the surface. And Harold Bride, believe it or not, would end up surviving the evening. Now, once Collapsible B went down to the boat deck, Lightoller walked over to the Titanic's starboard side to see if there was anything he could do with Collapsible A. Once Lightoller reached Collapsible A, he noticed something odd that was going on the Titanic's starboard side. Due to the Titanic's very sharp list to port, the water had not yet swamped the starboard side of the boat deck, which could have given the false impression that they had more time to prep Collapsible A than what they really did. With Lightoller's assistance, the crew was able to slide Collapsible A from the roof of the officers' quarters down to the Titanic's boat deck without flipping it over, and the crew there began to try to connect Collapsible A to the Titanic's davits. These people were under the impression that they still had more time to try to prep this lifeboat. However, what they did not know was that the sinking of the Titanic was about to once again rapidly accelerate. It is now 2:14 a.m. on board the RMS Titanic. The bridge of the Titanic is nearly completely underwater, and the sinking of the Titanic is now accelerating. Now, remember earlier in this video how I talked about how the Titanic had a sharp list to port for a good chunk of the sinking. However, as the final plunge continued, the Titanic would more or less return to an even keel? Well, that's about to happen. As the Titanic's bridge went underwater, the Titanic's very sharp list to port went away, and the Titanic actually rolled back onto an even keel. Now, while it doesn't seem like that it would be that big of a deal, at least at first, the fact that the Titanic returned to an even keel would have drastic consequences to all of those working on Collapsible A on the Titanic's starboard side. And then it happened. At 2:15 a.m., the Titanic's port list went away and the ship returned to more or less an even keel. When this happened, this sent a huge wave of water washing over the starboard side boat deck, right where Collapsible A was. Now remember, Collapsible A is still tied to the Titanic, so the fact that this wave showed up meant that Collapsible A was now about ready to be dragged down underwater with the rapidly sinking Titanic. So in order for the Titanic's crew to keep Collapsible Lifeboat A from being dragged down with the Titanic, they literally had to pull out knives or anything sharp that they had in order to try to cut these ropes to free this lifeboat from the davits. They couldn't simply just release this lifeboat from the davits because they need slack in the ropes in order to free the lifeboat. However, because the Titanic was now dragging Collapsible Lifeboat A down with it, the ropes were tight. There's no way they could release the ropes from the davits by normal means. They had to cut the ropes in order to free Collapsible A from the Titanic. And now they were successful at doing this. However, at the time, Collapsible Lifeboat A had a good number of people in it, and the Titanic had dragged it down so low into the water that water was about ready to spill into the lifeboat. So this lifeboat was dragged pretty deep into the water. However, when they cut the ropes and freed Collapsible A from the Titanic, the whole lifeboat shot up out of the water and it threw most of the people into the sea. And then these people had to scramble back into this lifeboat. This, as a result, did partially flood Collapsible A, which meant that all the people that were in Collapsible A had to deal with a small amount of freezing water that was located within the lifeboat as a result of all of this stuff happening as they were trying to free Collapsible A from the rapidly sinking Titanic. Now, while all of this drama was going on with Collapsible A, something very strange happened to the Titanic itself. You see, once the Titanic had returned to an even keel, those who were around Collapsible A said that they noticed something very strange with the Titanic. They said that for a very brief moment, the water, even though it had been quickly advancing up the starboard side boat deck, for a moment, the water stopped advancing and the Titanic temporarily stopped sinking. So, what do I mean by this? Well, it seems like that once the Titanic returned to an even keel and the water went crashing up the boat deck, the water paused advancing. And then, believe it or not, survivors said that they saw the Titanic actually, very briefly, lift a little bit up out of the water. Pretend my hand's the water line. They saw the Titanic itself just lift up very briefly for about 5 to 10 seconds, and then the ship continued to drop like a rock. Now, what caused this? And to be honest, we don't really know, but I do have a theory. My only guess as to why the Titanic would temporarily stop sinking and momentarily begin to lift up out of the water is that maybe, just maybe, when the Titanic returned to an even keel, the whole motion of the hull may have allowed some new air pockets to form within the Titanic that could have given it this momentary buoyancy, which allowed the Titanic to briefly lift up out of the water. But then, once the ship stopped rocking, those air pockets quickly refilled with water, and then the Titanic continued to sink. So, as I said, I can't prove this, and this is just a theory that I came up with based on the available information. However, given all the facts that go along with this, I think this theory could be plausible.
And if you thought we were done with 2:15 a.m., well, guess what? We're not quite done with this point in time with the Titanic yet. Believe it or not, right around the time that all of this was going on, one of the most incredible survival stories of the entire Titanic disaster happened to Second Officer Charles Lightoller.
Once this big wave washed over the Titanic's starboard side, Lightoller saw that the Titanic was rapidly sinking. So at this point, he decided it was time to abandon the vessel. What he decided to do was jump from the roof of the officer's quarters somewhere around the first funnel and jump into the sea and swim away from the Titanic. Once he jumped into the water, he almost went into shock. He said the water was so cold that it felt like 1,000 knives stabbing him all across his body all at once. Now, once he surfaced, he looked out towards the front of the Titanic, which has long been underwater, and he saw the Titanic's crow's nest, which at this point was basically level with the waterline. So at that point, Lightoller started to swim towards the crow's nest as a place of safety. And then he thought, no, I shouldn't swim towards the crow's nest. It's attached to the ship. It's about to go into the water. So once he came to his senses, he turned around and swam back towards collapsible lifeboat B. But then something terrible happened. There was an air vent or something underneath him that water was flooding into, going deeper into a submerged part of the Titanic. And the water current sucked Lightoller down, and he got pinned to this air vent. And he said he remained there for quite a long time. And then a miracle happened. A rush of hot air that came from somewhere deep within the ship blew up through this air vent and freed him from it. And then another air vent sucked him down. And somehow he was able to free himself from this air vent as well. Once he got clear of all this, he swam over to collapsible B, where he would remain throughout the rest of the evening.
It is now 2:16 a.m. on board the RMS Titanic. The Titanic is beginning to drop like a rock. Inside of the grand staircase, if anybody was still in there at this late stage in the sinking, they would see a giant wall of water getting ready to consume everything within the grand staircase. Meanwhile, towards the back part of the Titanic, 4th Officer Boxhall in Lifeboat Number 2 saw how quickly the Titanic was getting ready to go down, so he abandoned his attempts to try to save any more people from the Titanic and began to row away from the Titanic as quickly as possible, because if he had stayed where he was and tried to rescue any more people from the doomed liner, it's very possible that Lifeboat Number 2 could have been destroyed by the rapidly sinking Titanic. At 2:16 a.m., the Titanic was dropping like a rock. Now, if you were around the first funnel at this point, you may have started to hear a snapping sound coming from the first funnel. What this was all the support cables holding the first funnel to the ship were beginning to snap. The first funnel fell forward and to starboard. The wave generated by the first funnel crashing into the sea pushed collapsible A and B away from the rapidly sinking Titanic. At the back of the Titanic's massive propellers now begin to climb higher and higher out of the water. At the exact same time this is happening, the grand staircase dome finally dips beneath the surface. When this happens, the grand staircase dome implodes, and tons of seawater now begin to flood the now submerged grand staircase. It is now 2:17 a.m. on board the RMS Titanic. Those on board the Titanic are trying to flee as far aft as possible. Around this time, the Titanic's second funnel fell, and the Titanic's stern section is now sticking up around 23 to 24 degrees up and out of the water. The survivors said at this time that they heard a gigantic explosion come from the ship, and right after the explosion, most of the Titanic's power went out, although it did not completely go out. Now, right after the explosion, the Titanic's stern seemed to fall back level for a brief period. What has just happened is the Titanic had just split in two. The bow section of the ship, now free from the stern, is now heading for the seafloor, while the stern section, which still has air in it, falls back level for a brief period of time after the breakup.
Now, when the Titanic broke in half, the ship broke apart right around here, just forward of the Titanic's third funnel. However, even though the Titanic did break into two large pieces, it would be more accurate to say that the Titanic broke into four pieces. You see, from the breakup point to just forward of the fourth funnel, This huge chunk of the Titanic superstructure / hull ended up breaking apart as the breakup occurred. So if you go down to the Titanic wreck site, you'll see these two other big, huge masses of steel and metal that don't really look like they belong to any part of the ship. What that is the two big chunks of the Titanic's hull / superstructure that ended up breaking apart during the Titanic's breakup.
Now, many people have asked me, how on earth could some of the lights on board the Titanic's stern section have stayed on after the breakup? Wouldn't the Titanic's engine room have been severely compromised by the ship splitting apart? Well, yes, you would be right. The engine room would be nearly non-functional, if at all functional, at this late stage in the sinking. However, the real reason that I believe the emergency lights stayed on have to do with the Titanic's emergency dynamo, which was not positioned in the Titanic's engine room. The emergency dynamo was actually located on the Titanic's D-deck level, just underneath the fourth funnel. So because of this, it does make sense that once the Titanic's main power failed, the emergency dynamo would kick in to keep a few lights on board the Titanic's stern section glowing briefly after the Titanic broke in two. It is now 2:19 a.m. on board the RMS Titanic. Most of the ship is gone, and what little parts of the Titanic that are still above the surface are now sticking nearly straight up out of the water. The only thing keeping the ship above the water at this point is the trapped air within the stern. And then at 2:20 a.m., as water begins to rush inside the stern and the trapped air begins to escape, the Titanic's stern slowly but surely dips beneath the surface, casting the 1,496 people that are still on board the Titanic into the freezing cold North Atlantic Sea. You have to remember, the water temperature on the night that the Titanic sank was 28 degrees Fahrenheit, or -2 degrees Celsius. The average life expectancy in water this cold is less than 15 minutes.
Boy, I tell you guys, whenever you work on a video like this that covers a timeline of a series of events that have to go along with a disaster like the sinking of the Titanic, one thing I have noticed when working on a project like this is it's easy to get caught up in the physics of what happened or the science of what happened, that we can accidentally lose sight on what was the most important aspect of this entire disaster, and that is all the people that were on board the Titanic on the night she sank. Now, don't get me wrong here. I'm not saying that we all forget that 1,500 people died when the ship sank. But what I'm saying is we don't really fully grasp the true horror as to what these people experienced as this ship was going down. We can get so caught up in the science or the physics of it that we don't really stop to imagine what it must have been like for all those people when the ship was sinking. But as I was putting this video together, I really felt like I got an understanding as to the true horror that all those people on board the Titanic must have experienced when the ship went down. I mean, honestly, I can't even put into words how horrible and terrifying it must have been for all those people. So I think the best thing that we can do to be sure that none of those people's memory will be forgotten is that each and every single one of us that is interested in the story of the Titanic does our part to make sure that we honor all of those who lost their lives when this ship sank. And we each do the best that we can to make sure that their memory will never be forgotten. I'm also going to dedicate this video to the memory of all of those who lost their lives on board the RMS Titanic when the ship went down. May you all rest in peace. Anyway guys, this is Sam from Historic Travels, and I wanted to thank you all so much for watching. Be sure to leave a like, be sure to subscribe, and thank you all so much for tuning in, and I will see you all in the next one. Have a good day everybody, and thank you all so much for watching.
Thanks to our Captain level Patreon supporters, Olivia Julius, Canadian, Greg Gatlick, and Callum Whaley. Thank you all so much for all the support.